We heard that the issue of the constitutional reform that is being debated for the last 30 years as a result of the 1980 coup and the subsequent imposition of a rather authoritarian constitution, but in fact constitutions in Turkey have been introduced often by fiat without much domestic political support. Third, civil-military relations. Again, we're talking about civil-military relations. Yes, the military is weaker today, as I will make that point, but we are still talking about civil-military relations. So the question is, why are we doing all of this? Before I go into the why, let me just stress that on all three issues, there clearly has been some change. On all three issues, the old adages have changed. There is much more discussion. There is actually prospect for change. So in that sense, it's positive. But let me offer three very broad brushstrokes to say why is it that Turkey still has not resolved these things. Number one, I would argue that Turkey is an extremely ideological state. It is an ideology that was actually not necessarily created by the founder of the state, Kemal Atatürk, but really by his successors. The Kemalist ideology was not Mustafa Kemal's. I mean, he tried to reshape Turkish society in his own image. He thought that the Turkish public was not sufficiently civilized, needed to be brought into the 20th century, screaming maybe, but nonetheless that's what but it is a republic he created in his own image. The problem was when he died, his successors, in order to be able to continue with this edifice that he had created, had to come up with some system, and that system was the Kemalist ideology, which in many ways was very strict, did not allow for a great deal of debate, and in fact it became the ideological underpinnings of the state became far more pronounced with time as society started to question, push, and challenge some of these precepts of the Kemalist ideology. And it is the military, the judiciary, as we heard, academics, I'm afraid to say, civil bureaucrats, who essentially kept the banner of this Kemalist ideology. And even the military came up with this very interesting adage called the Atatürkist way of thinking that had to be taught everywhere, in schools, in the military academies, and everywhere, so that there was a conception in their mind as to what this meant. But this ideology, I would argue, was in many ways quite hollow. But the problem with it was that it prevented the creation of a real dialogue in society, a real discussion. You couldn't discuss anything in Turkey unless you ultimately justified your position on the basis of the Kemalist ideology. I mean, you could make up things and say, Mustafa Kemal said this, and then people will accept it. But so long as you justified it in that way. So that's the first thing is the remnants or the ideology. It is actually under stress, and it is slowly being done away with, but it's not gone by any stretch of the imagination. The second is the burden of history. Turkey is, after all, and we heard it in the previous panels, is the remnant of a large empire. And the burden of history touches modern Turkey in two different ways. One is how to interpret the history, the creation of myths. And to some extent, those myths also have to do something with the Kemalist ideology. But it is the myths, the foundation myths, the Sèvres Treaty that people use to essentially justify a rather xenophobic approach to foreign policy, to minorities, etc. It is also a myth, as Amberin Zaman earlier said, that people don't know what happened in Turkish history. I mean, it is fortunate that a rather poor, lousy CHP politician suddenly created a crisis this past year with Tunceli and what happened in Tunceli in 1937, that suddenly people started to hear for the first time that there had been a major revolt, And people, by the way, went through, and this has to do again with the ideology, went through life believing that this Turkey was a homogeneous country where there were no pious constituents or citizens or no Kurds. So, but that's the burden of the other. I mean, the burden of history also works in a slightly different way, and that is that states come into existence as a result of wars, fighting, and so on. And it turns out that the way the Turkish state ultimately ended up the way it is now, I mean, it wasn't foreordained that the current borders of Turkey would be the borders. This is where the Republican armies of Atatürk essentially finished. They could have gone further south, right? In fact, Hatay was not part of the original Turkish Republic. So how those borders were created has had an impact. If, let's say, the southeast was not part of the current Turkish political boundaries that in 1923 Turkey had been created in a different way, we may have not been talking about the Kurdish problem today. So it's a little bit the accidents of history. Third is the international environment. The international environment in the 1920s, 1930s. I mean, if you look at when the state was being created, what examples did Atatürk have, essentially? Soviet Union? Wonderful. Nazi Germany? Fascist Italy? I mean, even Britain was a colonial empire. I mean, we have to remember that the Turkish state emerged at a time where the examples were bad. But after that, the Cold War infrastructure in the world essentially meant that some of these issues could be, I mean, I shouldn't put it this way. The Cold War created a cocoon in which most of these issues could not be discussed. It helped the ideological system to perpetuate itself. As I said, all these things are changing, and clearly the end of the Cold War, the replacement of the Cold War, shall we say, narrative by the European Union has changed the situation, which brings us to today and to the AKP. I put my watch out, but I forgot to look at when I started. AKP came to power with a great deal of promise. And I have to say that it is very, very important to understand that in many ways, AKP's promise and its success in winning an overwhelming majority in parliament, both in 2002 and later in 2007, was crucial because it is a political movement whose origins are in Turkey's Islamic politics. Yes, it broke away with the more hardline Islamists, but nonetheless, when you look at the leadership of the AKP today, I mean, these were the same people who were with Erbakan through the 1980s, late 1980s, certainly in the 1990s. So they come, but for an Islamist movement to embrace the European Union, to embrace change, to embrace reform, was actually very, very critical for Turkey, in the sense that the same ideas being pushed by the traditional political parties were they to do it would not carry the same weight in Turkey, especially because the discourse of the Islamic movement in the past had been so anti-reform, anti-Western, etc. But it is also true that AKP took over a country that was very, very different than anything Turkey was before. And it isn't, I mean, they were lucky. I mean, they were genuinely lucky. And the person who should deserve credit for this is Turgut Özal, because he pushed a series of economic reforms that opened up Turkey in a way in which the fruits of that labor, the fruits of those reforms, we can see them now.